Welcome to Whispers in the Wind, stories of true crime.
Whenever you're ready, Mr. Lally.
Thank you, Honor.
And I ask only that you keep your voice up, please.
I'll do my best. Good morning. So as Her Honor was telling you, this is one of the two opportunities that I will get to address. The first of which right now, essentially what I'm going to attempt to do, and I know you heard over the course of the impoundment process a number of different witnesses that were listed out as far as potential witnesses in this case. So what my intent here is to provide as much of a roadmap as I can through those waters and help me to navigate sort of who these people are and what relation they have to this case. We start with John O'Keefe. John O'Keefe grew up in Braintree. He was 46 years old when he passed. He was the son of John O'Keefe Jr. and Margaret or Peggy O'Keefe. He was a brother to Paul O'Keefe and to his sister Kristen Furbush. Kristen was married, and so John's brother-in-law was a man named Stephen Furbush, and they had two children who were very young in 2013. Now in 2013, Kristen, unfortunately, tragically passed away, succumbing to cancer in November of 2013. Within months of that, Mr. O'Keefe's brother-in-law and Kristen's husband, Stephen, passed away as well. Now, initially, when John O'Keefe's sister passed away, sort of the initial plan for that situation was that John O'Keefe was going to move in with Stephen Furbush and the kids and assist as far as raising them. And then, when Stephen passed away a few months after his wife, before those plans could be finalized, John O'Keefe then moved in with his niece and nephew and assumed the parental role and assumed legal guardianship with respect to both of those children. Now, he was assisted in this by a great number of people within the town of Canton where the Furbushes lived and where John moved into, the home with the two children there. There were other parents within the neighborhood, other parents within the children's age group. You'll hear from a number of them over the course of this trial, but they include Mrs. Carrie Roberts and Mrs. Jennifer McKay. They helped Mr. O'Keefe out during those initial stages and during the time that he assumed this role. He also got help from his work. John O'Keefe was a proud member of the Boston Police Department, had been for many years. He had been a patrolman prior to moving in with the children and assuming this sort of role. Boston Police Department helped him greatly as far as transitioning him to more of a desk role, working in the sex offender unit. With more regular hours to sort of assimilate himself to this new life and this new role that he assumes with these children. Initially, John O'Keefe lived in the house with the kids. However, in 2018, they moved into a new home, sort of a new home that they could have as their own. That home is located also within the town of Canton, sort of on the Stoughton side of Canton at One Meadows Avenue. John O'Keefe raised these children, assuming guardianship for them for about 8 years. His niece, who was the elder of the two, was about 14 at the time that John O'Keefe died, and his nephew was about 11 years old at the time that John O'Keefe died. January 28th, 2022 was a relatively typical day. It was a Friday going into a Saturday of January 29th. Sort of typical in the sense of most sort of suburban parents. There were a lot of activities, weekend sports, practices, games, things of that nature that the O'Keefe and Furbush family had to look forward to. One little difference when it came to that particular day of January 28th and the 29th is the weather. So there had been predicted and there was going to be a snowstorm, an insignificant one. A blizzard essentially was coming in overnight that Friday and the Saturday, lasting through most of the day on Saturday the 29th. And as a result of that, most of those sort of typical, weekend routine activities that would keep most people, including those within the town of Canton, busy, have been canceled ahead of time. Everybody knew what was coming. Everybody knew, essentially, you weren't going to leave your house all that much the following day. Now, also on January 28th, Mr. O'Keefe had received some news in respect to his niece. So his niece and her best friend were in 8th grade at the time, going into high school in the fall of 2022. They had both applied to a private school called Bishop Ian, and they had both found out on the 28th that they had been accepted to that school. So the friend, as well as her father, a gentleman by the name of Michael Camerano, who's both he and his wife, Catherine Camerano, were friendly with John O'Keefe. They had children around the same ages as both John's niece and his nephew. And they had come over to their house on Meadows Ave that evening to celebrate the girls getting into that school. The nephew of John, the 11-year-old, was sleeping over a friend's house that night. He left that home sometime around 7 p.m. or so, got picked up, and went to sleep over at his friend's house. John O'Keefe and Michael Camerano then decided to travel out to a local establishment on Washington Street called C.F. McCarthy's Bar and Restaurant. You're going to hear testimony, and you're going to see surveillance video, and you're going to see receipts and all kinds of things from a variety of different establishments, all sort of located within Camden Center along that strip in Washington Street. Now, they get Mr. O'Keefe and Mr. Camerano leave the girls at home. They then go to C.F. McCarthy's, arriving there sometime between 7:30 and 8 p.m. They eventually cajole another friend of theirs, Mr. Kurt Roberts, to come out to the bar and join them as well. And there's some other people that are located within the bar, including a Mr. James Sullivan, who we hear from, who was present at the bar that night as well. Eventually, the defendant, Karen Reed, joins them at this establishment, C.F. McCarthy's, sometime just before 9 p.m. Now, John O'Keefe and Karen Reed had met sometime in 2004. They had dated briefly during that time and reconnected sometime around March of 2020, around the time of the COVID-19 sort of pandemic shutdown. They had started dating around that time period, or reconnected during that time period, and the defendant had stayed at the house in Canton several nights a week. She had helped out with the children. In the month or so leading up to Mr. O'Keefe's death, the relationship soured. You will see text messages between Mr. O'Keefe and Ms. Reed to that effect. You will hear testimony from the children, from John's niece and nephew, in regard to things they observed within that relationship. And you'll hear testimony from other individuals as far as their observations or things that they heard. Turning to January 29th, 2022. Just after 6 a.m., the Canton Police Department receives a 911 call from a woman reporting a male party, subsequently identified as John O'Keefe, found in the snow outside a residence at 34 Fairview Road. At the time, as I mentioned, the blizzards that had been predicted was occurring, heavy snow, temperatures in the teens, wind bustling around. Officer Stephen Saraf and Officer Stephen Mulaney of the Canton Police were dispatched along with Canton Fire and EMS, and you'll hear from them in regard to their response and what they observed on scene. In particular, with Officer Saraf, you'll have as an exhibit, I anticipate, a cruiser camera video from his cruiser detailing or memorializing sort of his response in the darkness, in the blizzard-type conditions as he's driving from the Canton Police Station, where he was located when he received the call, to 34 Fairview Road. When they arrived there, they observed three individuals, three females, sort of off to the left side of the property. And when I say the left side of the property, I mean if you're standing out in the street facing 34 Fairview Road, off to the left side of the property, there's a flagpole, there's a fire hydrant, there's some bushes. That is where Mr. O'Keefe is located. To the right side of the property is sort of the driveway and the mailbox and other things that you'll become familiar with through photographic evidence and other means through the course of this trial. The three females that the officers observed there were then identified as the defendant, Karen Reed, Mrs. Jennifer McCabe, who had received a phone call earlier in the morning from the defendant, as well as Mrs. Kerry Roberts, who had also received a phone call early that morning from the defendant. The several firefighters from the Canton Fire Department you'll hear from in regard to their observations of injuries, abrasions, and lacerations to the right arm of Mr. O'Keefe. We'll hear their testimony in regard to swelling of his eyes and other injuries that he observed. They observed redness from the cold that he had been lying out in for some time. You'll hear the testimony from these firefighters of Timothy Nuttall, Anthony Flamati, Matthew Kelly, Francis Walsh, Katie McLaughlin, and Greg Woodbury. And at least from 3 of those firefighters, you'll hear testimony anticipates detailing statements that the defendant made to them when they had asked about the origination of some of those injuries. The defendant stated repeatedly, "I hit him, I hit him, I hit him." Mr. O'Keefe was then taken from the front lawn onto what they call a scoop stretcher. As he's doing that, I anticipate you'll hear Ms. Roberts' testimony that despite the 6 inches of snow approximately that was on top of Mr. O'Keefe's body and the snow throughout the roadway, front yard, everywhere around where he was, there was grass underneath Mr. O'Keefe, where his cell phone was located underneath his body as he lay on that front lawn. He was then transported by firefighters Kelly, Flamati, and Nuttall, as well as the ambulance being driven by firefighter McLaughlin to the Good Samaritan Medical Center. Once there were some observations, and you'll hear testimony from Dr. Justin Rice from that facility as far as observations consistent with what I anticipate you'll hear from those firefighters. But then there is a certain warming procedure that they go through trying to bring his body temperature up. Because when Mr. O'Keefe arrives at the Good Samaritan Medical Center, his body temperature is 80. And after those resuscitative efforts prove unsuccessful, Mr. O'Keefe is eventually pronounced by Dr. Rice at approximately 7:50 in the morning. Shortly after that, when the defendant is then being driven away from the scene by Ms. Roberts, who is now going to go pick up Mr. and Mrs. O'Keefe, John O'Keefe's parents in Braintree, and then bring them to the Samaritan Medical Center in Brockton, the defendant makes some statements of self-harm. As a result of that, she's then transported to the Good Samaritan Medical Center as well by 2 firefighters named Daniel Whitley and Jason Becker. And amongst the statements that they gained from the defendant as they're having a conversation with her in regard to that, in regard to her treatment and diagnosis, she indicates that the last that she saw Mr. O'Keefe, they had gotten into an argument before he had gotten out of the car in front of Fairview Road. Now, you'll also hear testimony from some of the other first responding officers from the Canton Police Department, including Lieutenant Paul Gallagher, Sergeant Sean Good, and Sergeant Michael Lenk, in regard to their initial response, their observations, people that they spoke to, where they went, and their ability to recover within these blizzard conditions that are still ongoing, certain pieces of evidence that they located in around the area where Mr. O'Keefe's body was found. You'll also hear from Lieutenant Charles Ray of the Canton Police Department, who was tasked with, at this point in time, the Canton Police were unaware that the nephew was over at a sleepover. They were unaware that Mr. Camerano had come over to the residence on Meadows Ave and picked up the niece and bringing her back to his house as she was left unattended when the defendant left to go looking for Mr. O'Keefe. So unaware of that, they go do a well-being check at approximately 8:22 in the morning. And they also have cruiser camera video attached to their cruiser, and you'll see that video and when they pull into the driveway at Meadows Ave, approximately 8:22 in the morning, they pull in directly behind where eventually you'll hear Ms. McCabe left the defendant's vehicle after driving it from her house to Meadows Ave in search of Mr. O'Keefe. And you'll have that footage, and you'll be able to see the back of the defendant's vehicle, specifically the right rear taillight of that vehicle. Now, you'll also hear testimony, as I mentioned, from the Cameranos, from Mr. Roberts, from Mr. Sullivan. They were all present with the defendant and Mr. O'Keefe at C.F. McCarthy's. You'll hear testimony from a number of other individuals who were at the Waterfall. The Waterfall is a bar located across the street, essentially, from C.F. McCarthy's on Washington Street in Canton Center, and somewhere that Mr. O'Keefe and the defendant went after leaving C.F. McCarthy's at approximately 11 p.m. or so. Now, from that establishment, you'll hear from Rebecca Traers, who was working as a bartender at the Waterfall that evening. You'll hear from a couple named Nicholas and Karina Polakaitis, who were friends of friends, who had known Mr. O'Keefe through their daughter around the same age as Mr. O'Keefe's niece. Mrs. Kolakaitis had some conversation with the defendant that evening, as well as herself and Mrs. McCabe at the waterfall. She left around the same time as they did. She parked on Washington Street around the same area as Mr. O'Keefe and Ms. Reed did, specifically in Ms. Reed's car. And she observed Mr. O'Keefe and the defendant walking toward the defendant's vehicle, and specifically the defendant walking towards the driver's side of the vehicle. Now, you'll hear testimony from a Christopher and Julie Albert, who were people who were at one point neighbors of Mr. O'Keefe. They knew him well from being neighbors of him. Christopher Albert owned a pizza shop, also located within that Cannon Center area. Mr. O'Keefe, earlier in the day of the 28th, had been into that pizza shop along with his nephew to get his nephew a slice. Christopher Albert and Mr. O'Keefe had some conversation regarding what they were doing that night, and it's Christopher Albert who actually texts Mr. O'Keefe and indicates that they're over at the waterfall and that he should come over shortly before Mr. O'Keefe and the defendant make their way from C.F. McCarthy's over. Now, Christopher Albert left directly from the waterfall and went home. He was sort of walking distance away from there. His wife, Julie Albert, had left earlier in the evening. There was a band playing at the waterfall that night. Mrs. Julie Albert started to get a migraine, and she left before most of the group. Included within that group, and sort of how they came to the waterfall, the Albert family in particular, Julie Albert went there along with her sister-in-law, Nicole Albert, as well as her niece, Caitlin Albert, her niece's boyfriend, Mr. Christian Morris, and they had dinner at the waterfall earlier in that evening. Now, Nicole Albert lives at 34 Fairview Road. She has a husband named Brian Albert, who's also a Boston police officer. Brian Albert had gone with a friend of his, who's also in law enforcement, a man named Brian Higgins, and they had gone separately but had come home together from a funeral for a fallen police officer in New York City. They came home early to sort of beat the weather, and eventually they meet up with Brian Albert's family at the waterfall. Now, Tristan Morris, who was Caitlin Albert's boyfriend, had left the waterfall at some point in the evening. He then returns later to the residence on Fairview Road and picks up Caitlin Albert, brings her home. All of this is in relation to Brian Albert and Nicole Albert's son, Brian Albert Jr., whose birthday was coming up the following day, the day of the snowstorm on the 29th. So he had been back at the house at 34 Fairview while his family was out at the waterfall. He had a number of friends that had come over that evening to celebrate his birthday with him. Now, among those friends was two individuals named Sarah Levinson and Julie Nagel, and they were at the residence at 34 Fairview for a good portion. Now, those individuals from the waterfall then leave and then come to 34 Fairview. They do so sometime shortly after midnight. Shortly after midnight is when it starts to snow. Flurries are starting to come down. Snow is starting to stick to some degree to the road, to the front lawn, to the grassy areas around the town. Now, from that group, the group that goes back is obviously Brian Albert and Nicole Albert as they live there, Caitlin Albert, because it's her parents and her boyfriend is picking her up, as well as Jennifer McCabe, who is Nicole Albert's sister, and her husband, Matthew McCabe. They go back to that, and there's an open invitation to essentially anybody that's there. John O'Keefe takes them up on that. There are certain text messages and phone conversations between John O'Keefe and Jennifer McCabe as to where this house is located, as he's never been there before. And then he and the defendant drive in the defendant's vehicle to 34 Fairview. And once there are several witnesses from within the home that observe the vehicle parked in. So I mentioned earlier there were two females that were with Brian Albert Jr. at the house, one of them being Julie Nagel. At some point, she had called her brother, Mr. Ryan, for a ride home. He then gets a ride from his friends, Ricky DiAntonio, as well as Mr. Nagel's girlfriend, Heather Maxson, that's riding in the back of Mr. DiAntonio's pickup truck. I say that because they arrive at Fairview Road around the same time as the defendant. The defendant is coming in from one direction. The pickup truck with the Nagel brother is coming in from another direction. The pickup truck that the Nagel brother is riding in flashes its lights, signaling the defendant to go. She goes first. They follow in behind, and lo and behold, they end up at the same house. They park the pickup truck somewhere in that right side of the property, facing it from the street in the area of the driveway, and the defendant in her black Lexus SUV parks a little bit further up. Different people from within the pickup and different people from within the house observed that Lexus SUV in one location, pull up a little bit further, and then pull up a little bit further till it's in the area of that fire hydrant, of that flagpole, where Mr. O'Keefe is located the following morning. Now, from their position, I anticipate the testimony that you're going to hear is that Heather Maxson from that pickup truck observes a male passenger and a female operator when the pickup truck operator flashes those lights at the vehicle as they're facing each other before they pull down fairly. What you'll hear also, I anticipate, from all three of those individuals in the pickup and Julie Nagel, who comes out to the pickup to talk to the brother, is that no one ever exits that vehicle. There are no footprints around that vehicle. There's no damage that they observed to that vehicle at that time. Again, it's just started to snow. Things aren't sticking really too much at this point. Julie Nagel has a conversation with her brother, decides that she's going to stay at the house longer, so arrangements for a ride home, and the pickup truck leaves from that point. As they pass by, they observe a female operator, matching what I submit as the description of the defendant. From all of those people within that house that evening, none of them at any point in time observed John O'Keefe come into the house. They see the vehicle out front, they see the vehicle pull away, and they just assume that they left and that no one was coming in. You'll hear testimony from other individuals who were at the house that night, including Colin Albert, who is Julie and Christopher Albert's son. He's also the cousin of Brian Albert Jr., who was having people over for his birthday. He's leaving the house around the time that the initial people coming back from the waterfall, which includes the homeowners and Mr. Higgins, are sort of coming into the house. At that point, Colin Albert is leaving. He's getting picked up by a young lady named Allison McCabe, who is Jennifer and Matthew McCabe's daughter, who's also friends with Colin Albert and also cousins of Brian Albert Jr., who's within the home celebrating his birthday. As I mentioned, you'll hear testimony from Matthew McCabe and from Jennifer McCabe in regard to their observations that particular evening, both at the waterfall as well as at the residence on Fairview Road. And then you'll hear testimony in regard to a phone call. A phone call that Jennifer McCabe receives from John O'Keefe's niece at approximately 4:53 in the morning. She answers that phone call, speaks to the niece briefly, and the niece hands the phone over to the defendant. Now, you'll hear testimony from the niece as well that about 4:30 in the morning or so, the defendant came into her room in a frantic state, saying that Mr. O'Keefe had not come home the night before. So initially, when the defendant is talking to Ms. McCabe, she indicates to Ms. McCabe that the last time she saw Mr. O'Keefe was at the waterfall. Eventually, as Ms. McCabe is waking up, she reminds the defendant that she not only saw them leave the waterfall around the same time as herself, but also saw the vehicle, the defendant's vehicle, outside of the home on Fairview Road. Eventually, the defendant, while driving around, and this will come in as far as other testimony and related testimony as it develops, but she's driving around in that morning. She's calling a number of different people, friends of Mr. O'Keefe. She's calling Mr. O'Keefe himself. She also calls Ms. Roberts. So Carrie Roberts receives a call about 5 a.m. from the defendant indicating that Mr. O'Keefe did not come home, indicating that he got hit by a plow or that he must be dead. Ms. Roberts then gets ready. Ms. McCabe is getting ready as they're all sort of planning to go out and look for Mr. O'Keefe and see if they can locate him. They call numerous times. You can see that within the text messages and the phone extractions from a variety of people's different phones throughout the course of this trial as well. So eventually the defendant comes to Ms. McCabe's home, indicates at some point prior to that she has a cracked tailgate. Ms. McCabe then gets in the driver's seat due to the defendant's frantic state. Ms. Roberts is there as well. Ms. Roberts follows Ms. McCabe driving the defendant's vehicle back to Mr. O'Keefe's residence on Meadows Ave, checks on the niece. The defendant then shows both Ms. Roberts and Ms. McCabe the damage to her right rear taillight, which is essentially missing a number of different pieces from that right rear taillight. They then proceed off to drive and see if they can locate Mr. O'Keefe. The defendant is insistent that they go to that residence on Fairview Road. Again, they're driving down there in the dark, in the snow, in the wind, in the blizzard. As they approach towards that residence, there is one person. So they're seated within the vehicle. This is Ms. Roberts' vehicle, which she's driving. Mrs. McCabe is in the front passenger seat, and the defendant is in the rear passenger seat. The defendant is the only one who sees Mr. O'Keefe. He yells and screams at Ms. Roberts to stop the vehicle. Ms. Roberts and Ms. McCabe, I anticipate, will testify that they did not see Mr. O'Keefe, not only as they were driving past him, but even after they got out of the vehicle until the defendant gets out of the back seat and makes a beeline essentially right over to where Mr. O'Keefe's body is found. Mrs. McCabe then dials 911, and shortly after that is when the officers and the Canton firefighters arrive on scene. Now, while they're waiting there, at approximately 6:23, 6:24 a.m., during a conversation with the defendant asks Mrs. McCabe to look up on her phone how long someone has to be out in the cold to die from hypothermia, or something to that effect. And you'll hear some dispute as to when that search was made. You'll hear testimony from 3 different forensic extraction experts, Nicholas Carino, Ms. Jessica Hyde, and Mr. Ian Whiffen, who you'll hear about a lot of these things called extraction reports from cell phones. And the extraction reports are done with a program called Celebrate. And Mr. Whiffen is someone who writes that software for Celebrate. I anticipate you'll hear from each of their testimonies that Google search that was done on Ms. McCabe's phone was done at the same time frame that she indicates the defendant requested her to do it, and that at 6:23 and 6:24 morning. You'll hear testimony from Ms. Roberts, Ms. McCabe, the firefighters, and the responding Canton police officers about a repeated phraseology that the defendant stated while there, asking again and again in regard to Mr. O'Keefe, is he dead? Is he dead? You will also hear testimony, as I indicated, about sort of treatment that she received at the Good Samaritan Medical Center, and that would involve testimony of Ms. Daisy Ormseth, Ms. Kathleen Wilford, and Dr. Gary Fowler. You'll hear testimony from a number of different analysts from the State Police Crime Lab and from some other laboratories as well. Included within that will be Mr. Nicholas Roberts and Ms. Maureen Hartnett, Mr. Andre Porto, Ms. Ashley Vallier, and Ms. Christina Hannon, those all being from the State Police Lab. You will hear testimony in regard to an incident which occurred earlier in January, right around New Year's. Mr. O'Keefe, the defendant, and the children have been invited with a much larger group, approximately 70 people or so, to spend New Year's in Aruba. This is a trip that was organized by a friend of Mr. O'Keefe's named Laura Sullivan. You'll hear testimony from her, as well as from her sister, Miss Marietta Sullivan, as well as you'll hear testimony from the 2 children in relation to this. And essentially, day 2 or so of this trip, Marietta Sullivan, the sister of Laura, is walking through the lobby and she runs into Mr. O'Keefe. This is someone she refers to as Godfather, because John O'Keefe is also the godfather of Laura Sullivan's son. Runs into him in the lobby, gives him a hug, and is sort of pointing him in the direction of where she believes he's going into his room. The defendant is in the area. The defendant starts yelling and screaming and swearing at Ms. Sullivan. Ms. Sullivan responds in kind. And essentially, for the most part, the Sullivan sisters see very little of Mr. O'Keefe throughout the remainder of their trip to Aruba. And we also hear testimony from the children that shortly after this, or immediately after this, there is a approximately 20-minute screaming match going on between Mr. O'Keefe and the defendant within their hotel room in front of the children. Now, you'll also hear testimony from the defendant's phone in regard to, and from another individual's phone in regard to that Aruba trip, in regard to text messages of an amorous nature that she had with Mr. Brian Higgins, who was at the waterfall and also at the residence on 34 Fairview, because he was friends with the homeowner, Brian Albert, but he was also friends with Mr. O'Keefe and had also met the defendant. And throughout the course of those amorous text messages, there is references that the defendant makes to that incident in Aruba, as she purports it to be Mr. O'Keefe cheating on her. She insists that he was making out with Marietta Sullivan in that lobby as opposed to her giving him a hug, and makes repeated reference to that within the contents of those text messages as well. Now, you'll hear testimony from a number of different other individuals, Mr. Michael Trotter, who has a supervisory role with the Canton Department of Public Works. You'll hear from Mr. Louis Jutras, who has a supervisory role with regard to IT, in regard to certain video that was recovered from the town of Canton, as well as from a temple located along the route that the defendant traveled, both away from Fairview that evening, as well as to Fairview from the waterfall, away from Fairview to Mr. O'Keefe's residence on Meadows, and then later in the morning at 5 a.m. Because if you recall, Ms. McCabe, I anticipate, will testify that she receives the call from the defendant about 4:53 in the morning. The defendant then drives around Canton for some perceptible half-hour or so period of time prior to even getting to Ms. McCabe's house. And what I submit the evidence, or what I anticipate the evidence will show, based on sort of the tracking of her phone records, testimony you'll hear from Lieutenant Brian Tully of the State Police, from these Bolte records and RTT accounts, that the defendant, while she's using her phone, is driving in the direction of Fairview Road prior to going to Mrs. McCabe's house, where she meets Ms. McCabe and Ms. Robbins. Now, again, you'll hear testimony from a number of different troopers who were involved in the investigation. With regard to this case, you'll hear from Trooper Michael Proctor and Sergeant Beverly Cannone of the State Police. You'll hear from Lieutenant Brian Tully. You'll hear some testimony from Trooper Joseph Hall. He's in a specialized unit within the State Police called PARS for short, but essentially a collision analysis and reconstruction section within the Massachusetts State Police. His examination of the vehicle, his examination of the scene, his examination of specifically some Toyota texture, because Lexus is essentially owned by Toyota or vice versa. So there is some data that he's able to recover from that and back the vehicle up based on its known locations and travel and key cycles, and essentially opines, anticipate he'll opine that around 12:45 in the morning, when the vehicle was in front of the residence on Fairview, that for some perceptible period of time, that vehicle travels over 60 feet in reverse at over approximately 24.2 miles per hour. Now, you'll hear testimony, as I said, from a number of different troopers, as well as from a number of different analysts from different labs. Included within that is Ms. Maureen Hartnett, who collected items from the vehicle, the defendant's vehicle, including the taillight, sort of housing from that vehicle, pieces of the taillight that were discovered in sort of the front grass and front street area. There is a specialized team called the CERT team. You'll hear from Lieutenant Kevin O'Hara, who has a supervisory role in relation to that. And then later on that day of the 29th, he, along with Lieutenant Tully and a number of different members from his CERT team, were searching for evidence within the mounds of snow in front of that house, as the blizzard is still ongoing at this point through sort of the afternoon hours. Among the items that they locate is a sneaker. When Mr. O'Keefe is transported to the hospital, he's found to only have one sneaker on his feet. They find the other sneaker in that area of the body. They find various pieces of taillight. And as is wont to do, over the course of the following days, the temperatures rise, there's a rainstorm that comes in, and the snow melts. And over those successive days, there are additional pieces of taillights that are eventually discovered in that area of the front lawn in the street. Now, from these different pieces, Ms. Hartnett also locates a cocktail glass that's located on the bumper or the rear area of that scene, and she locates a human hair on the back of that defendant's vehicle as well. Now, the cocktail glass on the bumper, you'll also see surveillance video from the waterfall, and Mr. O'Keefe is observed on that surveillance video essentially walking out of the waterfall with a cocktail glass in his right hand. Same right hand that has minor injuries to it, and the same right hand that's attached to his right arm that has the abrasions and lacerations that are observed by the paramedics, that are observed by the doctors at Good Samaritan, and are observed by the medical examiner as well. You'll hear testimony from another analyst, Christina Hanley, about the forensic consistency between a drinking glass that was in the defendant's bumper and the drinking glass pieces that were found on scene at 34 Fairview. You'll hear her testimony in regard to pieces of red and clear plastic that were microscopic in size that were found within Mr. O'Keefe's clothing. Consistent, in her opinion, I anticipate she'll testify, with the same pieces of plastic contained within the defendant's taillight. You'll hear from an Ashley Valley who works for the lab as well, and how she fit the various pieces of broken taillight from the scene together and over that taillight housing, finding them to be consistent with each other as well. You'll hear testimony from Andre Porto, who's the essentially DNA analyst for the lab, and samples that were DNA samples that were taken from the taillight, from the clothes of Mr. O'Keefe, and the broken drinking glass that were consistent with Mr. O'Keefe. Those items were also sent, the taillight pieces, the taillight DNA was also sent to an independent lab, Beverly Technologies, located in Lorton, Virginia. And you'll hear from an analyst there, Mr. Nicholas Bradford, indicating that the DNA on the defendant's taillight, in his opinion, is consistent with that of Mr. O'Keefe, and inconsistent with Trooper Proctor and Sergeant Mechanic, who were the two preliminary investigators and primary investigators when it came to this case. You'll also hear from this test chart from that Bodie Laboratories in regard to some mitochondrial DNA that she examined in regard to that hair that Ms. Hartnett found on the bumper of the car, and her opinion that it was consistent with that of Mr. O'Keefe as well. Lastly, you'll also hear from Dr. Irene Scortibello and Dr. Renee Stonebridge of the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner in regard to their various examinations. Dr. Stonebridge is a neuropathologist. She essentially examines brain findings. Dr. Irene Scortibello is a forensic pathologist who does the sort of autopsy and medical examination of Mr. O'Keefe's body. And you'll hear about the variety of sort of injuries that she observed over Mr. O'Keefe's body from it. In particular, you'll hear testimony in regard to lacerations to the right back of his head. You'll hear testimony in regard to an initial sort of skull fracture that occurs to the back of his head, and then sort of a radiating skull fracture that goes throughout his skull, which then leads to subdural hemorrhage, or essentially bleeding on the brain and then swelling of the brain, which then causes a condition called ecchymosis, which then sort of leads to the swelling of both of Mr. O'Keefe's eyes that was observed by the initial responders. You will hear various testimony about sort of issues in regard to his pancreas and how that's indicative of hypothermia. Now again, as I said, this is the first of 2 times that I have an opportunity to address you directly. And I thank you very much for your attention today, and I thank you for the anticipation of your close attention as we go through all of the witnesses and all the evidence in this case. That second time that I do get to address you, what I'll be asking you to do, based on the evidence, and again, as the board has instructed you, you are the sole arbiters of the facts of this case. You are the ones who find what the facts, and I reiterate that, the facts, and what the evidence demonstrates in this case. And what I submit to you at that time, that second time, is that the only true and just verdict based on that is that the defendant, Karen Reed, is guilty of murder in the 2nd degree, striking the victim, Mr. O'Keefe, with a car, knocking him back onto the ground, striking his head on the ground, causing the bleeding in his brain, swelling, and then leaving him there for several hours in a blizzard with temperatures in the teens, wind swirling around, snow piling up on his body until she comes with Mrs. McCabe and Mrs. Roberts just after 6 a.m. And that she is also guilty of vehicular manslaughter, operating under the influence of liquor, and that she is also guilty of leaving the scene after causing death. Thank you very much for your time.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Lally. Mr. Netti?
Thank you for joining me here at Whispers in the Wind. If you enjoy this channel, please like, share, and subscribe.